The horse stopped, its breath a white plume in the air, and Elias Graves did not urge it on. He sat in the saddle, hands resting on the pommel, his body aching from 3 weeks of riding north, away from everything he knew. He looked down into the valley, at the collection of shadows that called itself a town. Sulphur Creek, the sign back on the trail had called it. It looked more like a wound in the earth. This was the place. It was nowhere. He rode the last mile down a track that was more frozen mud than road. The ruts were deep enough to break an axle or a horse's leg. To the east, thin columns of smoke rose from the mine shafts, staining the gray sky a dirtier gray. The wind had a knife's edge, coming straight down from the timberline where, Elias knew, wolves and worse waited for the weak. He had come to Montana in the fall of 1885, seeking a place where a name like Graves wouldn't turn heads, wouldn't draw a whisper. He wanted a place where no one knew what happened in Dodge City, what color badge he'd worn, or how much blood had soaked into the dust at his feet. The town was half abandoned. Half the buildings on the main street had their windows boarded up. The other half looked like they were barely hanging on. He bypassed the saloon, the clicking of the billiard balls and the sour smell of spilled beer leaking out into the cold. He went to the general store, which also served as the post office and the land agent's desk. A man with a face like worn leather looked up from a ledger. "Looking for something?" "A place," Elias said. His voice was rough from disuse. "Away from town. Got anything?" The man spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into a cuspidor. "Got a claim up northwest, worked out, far as we know. Shack on it, previous owner left in a hurry. Or in a box, can't recall." "I'll take it," Elias said. "Don't you want to see it? Just want the paper." Elias pulled a worn leather pouch from his saddlebag. He paid in cash, greenbacks and a few gold coins. The man counted it twice, his eyes narrowing slightly at the weight of the payment. But he asked no questions. Money was money. He slid a deed across the counter. "It's yours, mister. Watch the roof. And the wolves." Elias rode out. The shack was 2 miles from the town's last light, set on a rise of barren land. The land agent hadn't lied. It was broken. The porch sagged. The wind whistled through 3 broken panes of glass and a dozen gaps in the chinking between the logs. But it was private, and it was paid for. He spent the first week in silence, his world shrinking to the perimeter of the property. He worked from first light until his hands were too numb and his shoulders screamed. He hauled lumber from the nearby pines, using his hatchet and a rusty saw he'd found in the lean-to. He was methodical. He cut and planed the wood, repairing the porch steps. He used mud and straw to re-chink the logs, sealing the gaps against the growing cold. He replaced the broken glass with oiled canvas, shutting out the view but keeping the wind at bay. The land was hard. A hard frost settled in every night, making the ground like iron by morning. He dug a new latrine and the work took him half a day, the pickaxe ringing against the frozen earth. He slept, but he did not rest. He slept on a straw tick on the floor, his coat for a blanket and his saddle for a pillow. Under the saddle, cold and heavy, rested his Colt revolver. He woke often in the night, his hand gripping the walnut stock, the smell of gunpowder and fear still clinging to his memory. He would lie awake for hours, listening to the wind, to the high, lonely howl of a wolf pack in the timber. He avoided the townfolk. He had brought enough salt pork, hardtack, and coffee to last a month. He hunted for his suppers, a few rabbits, a stringy grouse. He was a good shot, quiet and efficient. He took no pleasure in it. On the 10th day, he saw her. He was on his roof, nailing down the last of the new-cut shingles, the metallic tang of the cold nails sharp in his mouth. He glanced east, toward the only other homestead in sight. It was a quarter-mile off, separated by a barbed wire fence and a patch of dead thistle. A woman was out back of the other house, hanging laundry. He stopped hammering. The wind was brutal, whipping her skirts around her ankles and tearing at the heavy, wet sheets in her hands. She wore a drab wool dress and no hat. Her hair, a dark brown, was pulled back tight, but strands had escaped and lashed across her face. He watched her fight the wind and the canvas. Her shoulders were set, her movements angry and strong. She was alone. There was no one to help her hold the line taut, no one to hand her the clothespins. She must have felt his eyes. She stopped, one hand holding a white sheet that snapped like a flag, and she turned her head. She looked right at his shack. He was a dark shape against the gray sky, a hammer in his hand. Elias expected a wave, a nod. It was the custom of the frontier, a small acknowledgement of shared hardship. Cora Bell did not wave. She stared at him for a long, hard second. Her face was pale and plain, shut tight against the cold, and against him. Then she turned back to her work, snatching another pin from the bag at her waist and driving it onto the line with fierce, deliberate force. Elias turned back to his hammering. The message was clear. He was to keep his distance. That suited him fine. He ran out of nails 3 days later. He also needed salt and kerosene. He put it off until morning, but the morning brought a new layer of frost, and the need was unavoidable. He saddled his horse, checked his revolver, and rode into Sulphur Creek. He tied the horse to the hitching post outside the general store. This time, the saloon was busier. It was past noon, and miners from the shafts were clumped at the bar, nursing beers, their faces gray with dust. Elias kept his hat low and went for the store counter. He gathered his supplies in silence. Nails, a sack of salt, 2 tins of kerosene. As he waited for the storekeep to tally the cost, he felt the atmosphere in the room shift. The miners at the bar had lowered their voices. "That's him," a voice muttered. "The new one. Bought the old Miller place. Another one. Wonder how long he'll last." Elias kept his back to them, focusing on the counter, on the slow scratch of the man's pencil. Then, the name. "He's moved in next to the Widow Bell," another man said. "This one closer." Elias could smell the cheap whiskey on his breath. "That one. She's trouble. Cold as this weather." "Cold?" A low chuckle. "Not what I heard. Heard she was plenty warm for old man Bell. Too warm, maybe. He died sudden," the first voice said, loaded with meaning. Man was strong as an ox. Then, one night, clutches his chest and falls flat, dead before the doc got there. "It was the stew," the whiskey drinker whispered, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Folks say she made his stew a little too strong. Put some seasoning in it." "Poison? You mean poison?" "I mean she ain't cried a single tear over him, just buried him and went right back to her chickens. Now this fella moves in. Wonder if she's looking to cook for him, too." A round of mean, quiet laughter. Elias's shoulders tightened. He felt the familiar, sick heat rise in his gut. The urge to turn, to grab the front of the man's shirt, to see the fear in his eyes. He knew that urge. It was the same one that had cost his brother's life. He crushed it. He laid his coins on the counter, the exact amount. He picked up his sacks, the weight settling him. He did not look at the men. He walked out of the store, the silence of the saloon following him like a physical weight. He mounted his horse and rode out, the whispers clinging to him. The widow, Cora Bell. He thought of her face, turned away from him in the wind. Not cold, guarded. He spent the next few days reinforcing his own small world. He built a better fence for his horse. He chopped a month's worth of firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only sound he made. He watched the smoke rise from her chimney, a thin, steady line. He saw her sometimes, chopping her own wood or carrying buckets from her well. She never looked his way again, and he kept his eyes on his work. The night the wolves came, it was dark. No moon, just a high, thin layer of clouds that trapped the cold. Elias was cleaning his rifle by the light of a single kerosene lamp. He had been restless all evening, the silence of the shack pressing in. He kept thinking of Dodge, of the smell of stale beer in that saloon, of the whispers. He heard it first. Not a howl, a sound of absolute panic. The frantic, terrified squawking of chickens, cut short by a wet, guttural snarl. He was moving before he thought. The rifle was already in his hands, loaded. He grabbed a handful of extra cartridges, shoved his feet into his boots, and was out the door, pulling his coat on as he ran. He didn't bother with the horse. He vaulted his own fence and ran across the frozen, dark expanse between their properties. The noise was worse now. A terrible ripping, snarling, mixed with the screams of the chickens. He saw the light. She was on her porch, holding a lantern high. The light was weak, casting huge, frantic shadows. He could see her shape, her arm raised. "Get back in the house," Elias roared, his voice tearing the night. He saw the wolf then, a big, gray shadow, its back to him, digging into the splintered wood of the chicken coop. A second one was circling, a dark shape with the yellow eyes that flashed in the lantern light. Elias dropped to one knee, bringing the rifle to his shoulder. He didn't have a clean shot at the first one. The second one, the circling one, saw him. It stopped, lowered its head, and snarled. "Mrs. Bell, get inside," he shouted again. He aimed for the center mass of the circling animal. He squeezed the trigger. The shot was deafening. The crack of the rifle echoed off the hills, a flat, hard sound. The wolf yelped, a high, sharp sound, and collapsed, its legs kicking for a moment before going still. The first wolf, the one at the coop, ripped its head out and spun. It was massive. It had blood on its muzzle and a dead chicken in its jaws. It saw Elias. It dropped the bird and snarled, a low, deep threat. Elias worked the lever on the rifle, chambering another round. He aimed. The wolf didn't wait. It turned and bolted, a gray streak vanishing into the darkness toward the timberline. Silence. Absolute. Ringing silence, broken only by the smell of sulfur and the heavy, panicked breathing of Elias. He stood up slowly, the rifle still pointed at the darkness. "It's gone," he said. He walked forward, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The lantern light was shaking. He reached the coop. The door was torn from its hinges. Inside, it was a massacre. Feathers and blood were everywhere. Of a dozen chickens, maybe 2 were still moving, huddled and broken in a corner. The dead wolf lay 20 yards away. He looked at Cora Bell. She was still on the porch, the lantern held in a white-knuckled grip. She hadn't moved. She was staring at the coop. "Are you hurt?" Elias asked. She shook her head, a small, jerky motion. Her face was bloodless. "Stay here," he said. He walked past her, his eyes scanning the perimeter, rifle ready. He checked the dark corners of her small barn. The lean-to, nothing. The danger was gone. He came back. He looked at the dead wolf. "Just the one. The other got away." Cora finally lowered the lantern. She stepped off the porch, her boots unsteady. She walked to the coop and looked inside. Her shoulders hitched once. She made no sound. They're mostly gone," she said. Her voice was flat. "Dead." "Yes, ma'am," Elias said. She looked at the dead wolf, then at the mess. "We can't leave them." "No," Elias said. "The smell will bring the other one back, and more." They stood in the dark. The cold was seeping back in, claiming the adrenaline. "I have a shovel," she said. "Get your lamp," Elias said. "And a thicker coat. I'll get my own shovel. We'll bury them. The wolf, too." He went back for his tools. By the time he returned, she was waiting. She had a pickaxe and a shovel. She had not put on a thicker coat. They worked for the next 2 hours, at the edge of her property. The ground was stone. Elias swung the pickaxe, his muscles screaming, the impact jarring up his arms and into his teeth. Cora worked beside him with the shovel. Scraping out the frozen clods of dirt, he broke loose. They didn't speak. The only sounds were the ring of the pick, the scrape of the shovel, and their own ragged breathing, steaming in the cold. They buried the chickens first, a small, sad pile in the bottom of the shallow grave. Then Elias dragged the wolf over. It was heavy, 120 pounds of dead muscle. They rolled it in on top of the birds. By the time they started shoveling the dirt back in, a thin, watery gray light was showing in the east. Dawn. They finished. They stood over the patch of raw, disturbed earth. Elias leaned on his shovel, his body spent. Cora Bell stood straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She was stiff, her whole body vibrating with a tension that hadn't broken. She looked at the grave, then at Elias. "I thank you, Mr. Graves," she said. Her voice was formal, brittle. She wasn't smiling. There was no warmth in it. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of a debt incurred. "Ma'am," he nodded. He looked at her eyes. They were gray, like the morning, and in them, he saw it. Not just gratitude, not just fear. He saw a tired, hollow sadness that was so deep it had no bottom. It was an exhaustion of the soul. He knew it. He saw it in his own shaving mirror every third day. She turned, without another word, and walked back to her house. The door clicked shut. Elias shouldered his shovel and pickaxe and walked back to his own shack. The sun was fully up, but it offered no heat. He cleaned the tools, put his rifle back on the rack, and sat on the edge of his cot. He was too tired to sleep, but the images of the night kept flickering, the blood on the snow, the yellow eyes in the dark. He lay back, his boots still on, and closed his eyes. He wasn't in Montana. He was in Dodge City. The dust was thick, choking. It smelled of cheap beer and fear. His brother, Jacob, was on the ground, his blue shirt turning dark red. Jacob was looking at him, his mouth open, trying to say something. You... Elias was frozen. His hand was on his pistol, but it felt like lead. The man who had shot Jacob was still there, his own gun smoking, a look of surprise on his face. He wasn't a threat. He was just a drunk kid. Elias drew. He fired again, and again. He didn't stop until the gun was empty. He woke up with a jolt, his hand grasping the empty air. The shack was cold. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He sat up, the sweat on his forehead already turning to ice in the frigid air. He rubbed his face, the old, ragged scars on his shoulder pulling tight. He had come west to bury the past, but the past wouldn't stay buried. And across the fence, he knew, was a woman who understood exactly what that meant. The day after the wolf attack, Elias took stock of his supplies. He had a small cache of nails he'd bought for his own shack, and there were still good, straight timbers left from the pines he had felled. He gathered an armload of the wood, put the nails in his coat pocket along with a clean rag and a small flask of carbolic, and walked the quarter-mile to her fence. She was already outside, trying to wrestle the broken door of the coop back onto its one remaining hinge. She was using a length of old barbed wire, her hands bare and red in the cold, trying to twist the rusted metal into a makeshift tie. He stopped a few feet away. "Ma'am!" Cora Bell froze. She did not look at him. She kept her grip on the wire, her shoulders tight. "Mr. Graves, I brought some lumber and nails," he said, dropping the wood by his feet. "That wire won't hold." "It will hold well enough," she said. Her voice was flat, pushing him away. "No, it won't. Not against a wolf. Not even against the wind." He pulled the nails from his pocket. "This coop needs to be rebuilt proper. I don't need your help." "I'm not offering help, ma'am. I'm offering nails. The wind gets in. The rest of your birds will freeze by nightfall." She yanked on the wire. Her hand slipped. The barb, sharp and rusted, tore a bright red gash across her palm. Cora hissed, a sharp intake of breath. She dropped the wire and turned away from him, cradling her hand to her chest, as if to hide the weakness. Blood welled up and dripped onto the frozen dirt. Elias was moving before she could protest again. He closed the distance, setting his jaw. "Give me your hand. It's nothing. It's rust and dirt. It'll be poisoned by morning. Give me your hand. Cora!" He said her name. It hung in the air between them, stark and sudden. She hesitated, her body rigid. He reached out, not grabbing, but firm, and took her wrist. Her skin was ice cold. He turned her hand over, his thumb pressing into her palm to open the fist she'd made. The cut was deep, ragged. She watched his face. He kept his eyes on the wound. Silently, he pulled the clean rag from his pocket. He uncorked the flask of carbolic with his teeth and poured a small, stinging stream of it directly into the cut. She flinched, her whole body jerking, but she did not pull away. The sharp, clean smell of the antiseptic cut through the morning air. He blotted the blood, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. Then he tore the rag into a neat strip and began to wrap her palm, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "You'll need to keep it clean," he said, his voice low. He tied off the bandage, his knuckles brushing the soft skin of her inner wrist. She was breathing fast, but shallow. She was looking at his hands. Not her own, calloused, scarred, but steady. "I could have done it," she whispered. "I know," Elias said. He let go of her hand. He turned, picked up his hammer from his own belt, and walked to the coop. "You go inside. Get that hand warm." She started to say something, to refuse again, but the words died in her throat. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a cold, weary shock. She watched him for a second, a strange, unreadable expression on her face. Then she turned and walked stiffly back to her house. Elias worked all morning. He tore down the broken parts of the coop, his movements economical and sure. He dug new post holes. He set the timbers, squared them, and nailed them fast. He used his own wood, his own nails, his own sweat. He rebuilt the door, stronger this time, and fashioned a new latch from a piece of iron he had in his pocket. He worked without stopping, the rhythm of the hammer a steady, angry beat in the silence. He was angry at the wolves, at the cold, at the whispers in town, and at the stubborn, breakable pride of the woman in the house. When he was finished, the coop was small, but it was solid. It was safe. He gathered his tools. He did not knock on her door. He simply walked back to his own land. Life settled into a new pattern. It was not friendship. It was a truce, drawn in the space between their two properties. The next morning, Elias found 2 white eggs sitting on the fence post that marked the edge of his land. The day after, he shot a rabbit. It was a clean shot. He dressed it, and that evening left the meat, wrapped in a piece of clean canvas. On her porch, he didn't wait. A few days later, he was checking the perimeter of his own fence and found her struggling to lift a heavy bucket of water from her well. The pulley was frozen. He walked over, took the rope from her bandaged hand, and hauled the bucket up, the ice cracking as it came. He filled her bucket, and then his own, and they walked back toward their homes, side by side for 20 yards, neither speaking a word. They traded. He had bullets and strength. She had 2 laying hens that had survived the attack, and a small root cellar. She would leave a jar of pickled beets. He would leave a stack of freshly split kindling. He fixed a loose board on her fence. She mended a tear in his canvas coat, leaving it folded on his porch, the stitches small and neat. A tension simmered. It was not a comfortable quiet. It was the silence of 2 people who knew the other was there. Every minute. He was aware of her. He knew when her light was on. He could tell by the smoke from her chimney whether she was baking or just keeping the chill at bay. And she, in turn, watched him. She watched him chop wood, his back a solid wall of muscle, the axe rising and falling with brutal efficiency. She watched him walk his land, his rifle in his hand, his steps slow and measured. A man who was always listening. The weather turned. The gray skies of October thickened, and finally, in the first week of November, broke. The snow began. It did not come gently. It came as a horizontal sheet of white, driven by a wind that moaned across the high plains. The temperature plummeted. The world shrank to the view from their windows, a swirling mess of white and gray. Firewood, which had been a chore, now became life. The mine shaft slowed. Men who had been digging for silver were now just trying to stay warm. Sulphur Creek grew desperate. The meager supplies in the general store dwindled. The saloon was full of men who had no work, no money, and a growing, cold-soaked anger. Elias felt the change. He spent more time hunting, going further into the timber, but the animals were scarce, hunkered down. He split his days between reinforcing his own shack and keeping watch on hers. He was coming back one afternoon, a string of 3 skinny rabbits over his shoulder. When he saw the man, he was a miner, identifiable by the heavy coat and the gray, permanent dust in his face. Elias recognized him from the saloon. He was standing by Cora's woodpile, the one stacked neatly against the side of her house. He was looking at her windows. Then back at the wood. He had an empty burlap sack in his hand. Elias stopped, melting back into a grove of bare aspen. He watched. The man, satisfied the house was quiet, walked quickly to the woodpile. He opened the sack and began to load it, grabbing the split logs by the handful. Elias unshouldered his rifle. He did not raise it. He walked out of the trees, his boots making no sound in the fresh snow. He was 10 feet away when he spoke. "That's not yours." The miner jumped, dropping the sack. Wood scattered. He spun around, his hand instinctively going to the knife on his belt. When he saw Elias and the rifle he held cradled in his arm, his hand froze. Just borrowing a few," the man stammered. His face was thin, his eyes desperate. "It's freezing. She's got plenty. She's got what she chopped." Elias said. His voice was quiet, but it was harder than the frozen ground. "Put it back, every piece. Now, listen here." The miner tried, finding a sliver of bravery. "You ain't no law. You're just the new fella. That widow ain't got no man to protect." Elias took 2 steps. He didn't raise the rifle. He moved faster than the man could track. He grabbed the front of the miner's coat, bunching the thick wool in his fist. He slammed him, hard, against the log wall of the house. The miner's head hit the wood with a dull thud. Snow cascaded from the eaves. "I am telling you," Elias breathed, his face inches from the man's. "To put it back." The desperation in the miner's eyes turned to raw fear. He had seen the look in Elias's eyes. It was a look that promised nothing but an ending. All right, the man wheezed, his hands coming up in surrender. No harm done. Put it back." Elias let him go, shoving him toward the scattered wood. The man scrambled, his hands shaking, stuffing the logs back onto the pile, his movements clumsy and terrified. When he was done, he backed away, holding a sack. "Don't come back," Elias said. The man didn't need to be told. He turned and half ran, slipping and scrambling through the snowdrifts, back toward town. Elias stood there for a long time, his breath pluming. The rage was still in him, a hot, sick feeling. He hated it. He'd come here to be done with this. The door to Cora's house opened. She stood there, her face a white mask. She had a shotgun in her hands, held low. She had seen the whole thing. Elias turned to her. He was expecting, he didn't know what, fear, maybe thanks. He got fury. "What do you think you are doing?" she hissed, her voice shaking with a cold rage that matched his own. Elias was stunned. "He was stealing your wood." "And you thought I couldn't handle that? You think I haven't handled worse?" She stepped out onto the porch, her knuckles white on the shotgun. "I've survived 3 winters here. I've survived men like him, and men 10 times worse. I don't need you. You were interfering." She snapped. "You were drawing attention. You think that helps? You think that man will go back to town and say what a gentleman you are? No. He'll go back and say the widow's got a new man. He'll go back and say we're together. You've just put a bigger target on this house than he ever did." She was right. He knew, instantly, that she was right. The whispers he'd heard in the saloon would now become a full-throated story. "I've survived worse than one filthy handsy miner," she said, her voice dropping to a low, trembling wire. "I don't need a man to fight my battles. I especially don't need one who brings his own ghosts to my door." The words hit him harder than the miner had hit the wall. He had no defense. He had acted. He had brought the world he was running from right to her fence line. Elias looked at her, at the shotgun, at the hard, unforgiving line of her mouth. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He turned, his shoulders stiff, and stormed away. He walked back to his own shack, the crunch of his boots the only sound. He didn't look back. He slammed his door. The shack was cold. He hadn't built up his own fire. He stood in the middle of the room, his fists clenching and unclenching. He had done it again. He had tried to protect, and he had only made things worse. He had brought death to his brother, and now he had brought trouble to her. That night, neither of them slept. In his shack, Elias sat in the dark, his rifle across his knees, and stared at the wall, the dream of Jacob's bloody shirt playing over and over in his mind. In her house, Cora lay in her cold bed, the shotgun leaning against the wall. She was wide awake, and the memory of the fight had brought back other, worse memories. She remembered her marriage. She remembered Silas Bell. He had been a big man, a man who owned the land and believed he owned her. Too, he was not a kind man. He was a man who took what he wanted. He controlled every dollar, every sack of flour. He'd told the town she was sickly, that she was barren, that she was unstable. It was his way of keeping her isolated, of making sure no one would listen if she cried for help. She had tried to leave. Once, in the first year, she had packed a small bag. He'd caught her at the edge of the property. He had dragged her back to the house. He hadn't used his fists. Not then. He had used rope. He'd tied her to the bedpost and left her there for a day and a night, to think on her vows. The bruises came later, a hand that gripped too tight on her arm, a shove against the wall that she was told to watch her step about. He never touched her face. He was careful. His death had been slow, a sickness in the gut that the doctor couldn't name. It had started in the spring and lasted clear through the summer. He'd gotten thin, weak. He'd spent his last 2 months in the bed he had tied her to, and she had tended him. She had brought him his broth. She had cleaned up his waste. She had sat by his bed and watched the cruelty and strength leak out of him, drop by drop. She never spoke of it. She never told anyone that in those last few weeks. He had been the one who was afraid. She had just survived. The blizzard hit 2 days later. It was not a storm. It was the end of the world. The wind didn't howl. It screamed. It was a physical white wall that erased the land, the sky, the space between their 2 shacks. Drifts piled up 10, 15 feet high, burying fences and turning the landscape into a white, rolling ocean. Elias was trapped. He had enough wood for 3 days, maybe 4. He spent the first day and night just listening to the timbers of his shack groaning, the wind trying to tear the roof from its walls. On the second night, the fire in his stove was low. The cold was a living thing. It found every crack he had sealed, every small gap in the logs. It settled on his skin, in his bones. He was wearing every piece of clothing he owned, and he was still shivering. And the ghosts came, in the screaming of the wind. He heard the gunshots in Dodge. He heard Jacob's voice. He smelled the gunpowder. He saw the blood in the dust, the cold, the dark, the solitude, it all mixed together. And the careful wall he had built around himself in Montana finally, completely broke. He was going to die here, alone, in a frozen shack, with nothing but his shame for a blanket. The man who came west to die was getting his wish. But the thought of Cora, just a quarter-mile away, trapped in the same white hell, ignited something. A last, desperate flicker. He pulled on his coat. He grabbed his rifle. Though he didn't know why, he found a length of rope and tied it to his door handle. He would tie the other end to his waist. If he missed her house, if he got lost in the white, he could at least try to pull himself back. He opened the door. The wind tore it from his hand and slammed it against the wall. Snow filled the cabin in a blinding, suffocating rush. He stepped out into it. It was not air. It was a solid, moving mass of ice. He couldn't see his feet. He couldn't see his hand in front of his face. He leaned into the wind and pushed, following the memory of the fence line. It took him an hour to cross land he had walked in 3 minutes. He fell. He lost his bearing. He was pulled back by the rope, his only anchor. He clawed his way through drifts that were over his head. He was not a man. He was a frozen, desperate animal. He hit something solid, not a tree, a wall. He felt it with his numb hands. Wood. The porch. He stumbled, fell against her door. And he didn't knock. He pounded, his fist a dead, heavy thing. The door opened a crack. He saw her eye, wide with fear. Elias, he fell forward, through the door, collapsing onto the rough floorboards of her cabin. The rope, still tied to his waist, snaked out into the storm. "The cold," he muttered. He was shaking, his whole body convulsing. The blood, so much blood." Cora slammed the door, fighting the wind. She threw the bar, shutting the storm out. Her cabin was small, but it was warm. A fire blazed in her stove. It smelled of coffee and wood smoke. She looked down at him. He was a heap of snow and frozen wool. He was not a threat. He was broken. "Get up," she said, her voice sharp, but not unkind. "You'll die there." He tried. He couldn't. His limbs wouldn't obey. He was muttering, his eyes wild. "Jacob, I walked away. I walked away from it all." Cora grabbed him under the arms. She was strong. She dragged him, his boots scraping the floor, closer to the stove, the only source of life in the room. "Get this coat off," she ordered. She helped him. Her hands were rough, practical. She stripped off his frozen coat, his gloves. His hands were blue. He was shivering so hard his teeth clicked. "You're a fool, Elias Graves," she said, but she was already at the stove, pouring coffee into a tin cup. She jammed it into his hands. "Drink." He drank. It was scalding hot, black and sweet. It burned a path down to his stomach. He coughed, and the shivering began to slow. He started. "Don't talk," she said. "Just sit. I'm not losing my neighbor to a storm. It's too much paperwork." He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, his legs stretched toward the stove. He drank the coffee. The warmth began to spread. The terror of the storm, the ghosts, began to recede. He was exhausted, more tired than he had ever been. His eyes grew heavy. He was asleep in 2 minutes, the tin cup still held loosely in his hand. Cora watched him. He looked younger, asleep. The hard lines around his mouth and eyes softened. He was just a man. She went to her own bed, but she didn't sleep. She sat in a chair, the shotgun across her lap, and watched him by the dim light of the stove's fire. In the middle of the night, he moaned, his shoulders twitching. He was dreaming. He shifted, his shirt pulling tight. Cora leaned forward. In the orange glow from the stove, she saw it. His shirt had pulled away from his shoulder. She saw the scars. They were old, but they were ugly. 2, 3 round, puckered wounds, the skin shiny and ruined, bullet holes. One on his shoulder, another lower, on his back, near the kidney, old and ragged. She stared at them. This was the past he carried. This was the violence he was running from. He hadn't just seen blood, he had shed it. He had bled it. A strange, unfamiliar feeling moved in her chest. It was not pity. It was recognition. A fellow survivor. He shivered again, even in his sleep. Cora stood up. She went to the old wooden chest at the foot of her bed. She opened it. The smell of cedar and mothballs came out. She reached inside and pulled out a heavy, dark wool coat. It was a man's coat, large, and of good quality. It had been her husband's. She stood over Elias. She looked at the coat in her hands, the last physical piece of Silas Bell. Then she looked at the scarred, shivering man on her floor. Slowly, carefully. She unfolded the coat and draped it over Elias Graves, covering him, covering the scars. She tucked it around his shoulders. He sighed in his sleep and settled. The shivering stopped. Cora went back to her chair. She sat in the dark, listening to the storm scream outside, and to the quiet, steady breathing of the man sleeping on her floor. He woke to the smell of coffee. The storm had passed. The wind was no longer a scream, but a low, distant moan. For a moment, Elias Graves didn't know where he was. The ceiling was too close. The air was warm, smoky, and didn't smell of his own damp, cold solitude. Then he saw the stove, its iron belly glowing a dull red. He was on the floor, on a braided rug. He was covered by a heavy, dark wool coat. He sat up. His muscles screamed. Every joint was stiff, frozen from the night's exposure and the hard floor. He looked at the coat. It was a man's coat, well made, but old. It was not his. He knew, with a sudden, sinking certainty, that it had belonged to Silas Bell. Shame flooded him, hot and fast. He had broken. He had come here, a stranger, and fallen apart on this woman's floor. He had muttered about Jacob, about blood. He had shown her the ragged, broken thing he was. He scrambled to his feet, his body clumsy. He folded the coat, his movements jerky, and set it on the chair she'd been sitting in. He had to get out. He had to get back to his own shack before she woke, before he had to face the pity or the fear. In her eyes, he turned toward the door. "There's coffee?" Cora was at the counter, her back to him. She had not been asleep. She was dressed. Her hair was pulled back in its tight, severe bun. She was scooping coffee grounds from a tin into her pot. She did not look at him. She did not mention the storm, or the coat. She did not ask about the blood, or Jacob, or why he had come pounding on her door like a madman. She was giving him a gift, the gift of her silence. He started. His voice was a raw croak. He cleared his throat. "I should go. The snow is 10 feet deep," she said, still not looking. She poured hot water from the kettle into the pot. "You aren't going anywhere until a path is dug, and you won't dig one on an empty stomach with frozen hands. Sit." It was not a request. It was the same practical, non-negotiable tone she used with the wind. Elias stood by the door, a big, useless, ashamed man. He wanted to leave. He wanted to run. But he also wanted, more than he had wanted anything in a long time, to sit down. He moved to the small table. He sat. She brought 2 tin cups, poured the coffee, black and thick. She set one in front of him. She took the other and sat opposite him. They drank. The silence in the small cabin was thick, broken only by the sipping, the low rumble of the fire. He looked at his hands, wrapped around the warm tin. He would not look at her. "The storm broke," he said, just to say something. "It did. My rope. It's buried." She said, "I cut it. It was letting the cold in." He nodded. He had survived. He owed her his life, or at least his pride, and he didn't know which was worse. He finished the coffee. It was scalding, and it burned away the last of the chill. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. Standing, he pushed the chair back. "For the coffee." "You'll need your shovel," she said, finally looking up. Her eyes were gray and held no pity. They just held a quiet understanding. "And so will I. We'll start with a path to the woodpile, then the well." The blizzard had changed them. The pretense of being strangers, of being just 2 neighboring properties, was gone, buried under 10 feet of snow. They were, instead, 2 people on an island of white, and survival was a shared burden. The routine that had been a simple, silent trade of eggs for meat now deepened, became a partnership. It had to. They spent that first day digging. It was brutal, back-breaking work. The snow was heavy, packed hard by the wind. They dug a trench from her door to her woodpile, then a longer one to the well. They worked in tandem. He would break the crust with the pickaxe, and she would follow with the shovel. Their breath plumed. Their faces grew red with the cold and the effort. They did not talk. They just worked. By evening, they had cleared a path to his shack. 2. It looked half buried. A sad mound of logs in the white. "Your chimney's clear," she said, a simple statement of fact. "I'll get a fire going," he replied, but that night she knocked on his door. He opened it, surprised. She held a steaming bowl. "Stew," she said. "I have too much, and you have nothing but salt pork." He took it. He had not eaten a hot meal like that since leaving Dodge. He stood in his own cold shack and ate the stew, and it felt like a betrayal of the solitude he had come here to earn. The next day, he was on her roof. The wind had ripped a dozen shingles clean off. He didn't ask. He just showed up, his hammer in his belt, the extra shingles from his own repairs in his hand. He worked all day, high above the snow, nailing and securing, his hands numb. Cora stayed below. She didn't hand him shingles. She was mending. He had left his coat, the one torn by barbed wire, at his door. When he came down from the roof, his work done. The coat was on his porch rail. The tear was gone. The stitches so small and neat he could barely see them. They talked, not of the things that mattered, but of the things that were real. "The soil is packed," she'd say, looking at the frozen ground. "It'll be hard for the spring seeds." "It needs ash," he'd reply, looking at his stove. "The fire's no good if it's not doing double work." They began to share a fire. It was her idea, though she never said it. She just started making enough stew for two, and he just started splitting enough wood for her stove to burn all night, stacking it on her porch. It was practical. One fire, one meal. It saved wood. It saved effort. He would come over at dusk. He'd sit at her table, and she would put a plate in front of him. They would eat, and in the quiet, the things they never spoke of grew louder. He learned her movements, the way she tucked a stray wisp of hair behind her ear, the way her mouth set in a hard line when she was concentrating. She learned his, the way he sat with his back to a wall, always, the way he cradled his coffee cup, his scarred hands warming to the tin, the way his eyes would sometimes go distant, staring at the wall, and she knew he was back in Dodge, back in the dust. One afternoon, she came to his shack. She didn't knock. The door was open, the day being marginally warmer. She was bringing him a loaf of bread, still warm, wrapped in a cloth. She found him behind the shack, at a small fire. He was kneeling in the snow. The fire was hot, and it smelled wrong. Not of wood. It smelled of metal and burning cloth. He had something in the flames, held by a pair of tongs. It was a star. A small, tarnished silver star, pinned to a piece of black leather. He was watching it melt. The silver curled, blackened, and dripped into the coals. He was destroying it. Cora stood, silent, the bread held to her chest. He knew she was there. He didn't turn. He just kept staring into the fire. "It was from Dodge," he said, his voice quiet, rough. A badge." He watched the last point of the star collapse, turning into a shapeless silver lump. "I swore an oath," he said, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. "To protect, to uphold the law." He poked the fire with a stick, burying the melted silver under the ash. "All it brought was death. It got my brother killed, and it made me a killer. It's just a piece of tin. But it's heavy." He stood up and kicked snow onto the small fire, extinguishing it with a hiss. He turned to her. His face was bare, stripped of all pretense. It was the face of a man who had just buried his last friend. Cora said nothing. She walked forward and held out the bread. He looked at the warm bundle, then at her. "Some things," she said, her voice just as quiet, "are too heavy to carry." He took the bread. His fingers brushed her knuckles. It was nothing. It was a spark on dry tinder. The air in the cabin grew thick after that. The confession had unlatched something. The practical, safe distance between them was gone. Now, there was just tension. It happened in the small, accidental ways. He was in her kitchen, which was now their shared space. He was helping her bring in a heavy sack of flour he'd hauled from town. The space was small. He turned, the sack on his shoulder, and she was right behind him. He stopped, and she bumped into him. He put a hand out to steady her, his palm landing flat on her hip, just for a second, to keep her from falling. She froze. His hand was large, warm even through her wool dress. He snatched it back, as if he'd been burned. "Sorry," he muttered, moving past her. The floor is uneven," she said, her voice thin. But the touch lingered, a patch of warmth on her hip that hadn't felt a man's touch in years, except in anger. And their eyes, they would be eating. The silence of the cabin broken only by the click of a spoon against a bowl. He would look up, and she would already be looking at him. Their eyes would meet, hold for a beat too long. He saw the loneliness in hers. She saw the storm in his. Then one of them would look away. Back to their plate, back to the fire. They danced around it. They skirted the edge of the thing that was growing between them. This fragile, dangerous need. They were two people starved, and they were sitting in front of a feast, terrified to take the first bite. The moment finally came on a Tuesday night. The wind was high again, rattling the canvas on the windows. He had just finished securing a loose board on her porch, and he'd come in for coffee. His hands red from the cold. They were at the table. The big oil lamp in the center of the table was their main source of light. It had been burning low. The oil scarce. Elias had been meaning to ride to town for more, but the snow was still too deep. As he was telling her about a fox track he'd seen, the lamp sputtered, the flame dipped, flared bright orange, and then died, plunging the room into near darkness. The only light left was the dim red glow from the stove's grate and the small, flickering candle lantern she kept on the mantel. The sudden dark was intimate, close. The wind outside seemed to get louder. I'll get the oil," she said, her voice suddenly uncertain. "It's empty," he said. He could see her silhouette against the stove's glow. "It's fine. The lantern is enough." He stood, walked to the mantel, and took the small lantern. It was an old thing, tin and glass. He brought it to the table and set it between them. The light was weak, casting huge, moving shadows. It threw the planes of her face into sharp relief, the hollows of her cheeks, the stubborn line of her jaw, the softness of her mouth. They sat in the small pool of flickering light. He was rubbing his hands together, trying to work the cold out of his knuckles. She was watching him, watching his scarred, capable hands. "You're a gentleman, Elias," she said. The words were so quiet, he almost missed them. He stopped rubbing his hands. He looked at her. Her eyes were wide in the lantern light. "No," he said. His voice was rough. "I'm not—" "You are," she insisted, as if to herself. "With the wood, with my hand. You were gentle." Elias leaned forward, his forearms on the table, his face coming into the light. The scars on his temple were stark. "I am the man who beat a half-starved miner against your wall. Cora, I am the man who emptied his gun into a boy in Dodge. The last thing I am is gentle." His honesty was a physical thing, a cold wind in the small room. Cora did not flinch. She held his gaze. The silence stretched. "I haven't been touched like a woman in years." She whispered. The words came out, a truth she had not even known she was holding. It was a confession to match his, a statement of profound, aching loneliness. Elias's breath caught. He looked at her mouth, then back to her eyes. The air was so thick he could barely breathe. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also the raw, desperate truth. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. It was not a gentle touch. It was a brand. His hand was calloused, hot and heavy. "Then don't call me gentle," he said, his voice a low growl. "Unless you mean it." She looked at his hand covering hers. She did not pull away. She slowly, deliberately, turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his. It was all the answer he needed. He stood, pulling her hand with him. He walked around the table, never letting go. He stood in front of her. She was still seated, looking up at him. He was a shadow, a mountain. Slowly, he reached out his other hand and touched her face. His fingers were rough, cold from outside. He laid them against her cheek. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing. He bent. He was slow, so slow. He was giving her every chance to turn away. He kissed her. It was not a soft kiss. It was an aching, careful, desperate thing. It was a kiss of two people who had forgotten what this felt like. It was slow and deep and full of all the words they could not say. It tasted of coffee and wood smoke and a winter's worth of loneliness. He felt her hands come up, her fingers gripping his shirt. He was drowning in her, and he hadn't known he was thirsty. Then, just as his hand moved from her cheek to her hair, she stiffened. She pushed against his chest. A firm, desperate shove. Elias stopped. Instantly, he stepped back, letting her go. Cora's eyes were wide, panicked. She was breathing hard, her hands up as if to ward him off. "Cora," he asked. "I can't," she whispered, her voice shaking. She scrambled back, away from him, her chair scraping on the floor. "I can't. I'm sorry," he said, his own voice hoarse. I misread." "No," she said, shaking her head, her back now against the counter. "No, you didn't. That's the trouble. I can't be someone's property again. I can't." The word hung in the air. Property. Elias looked at her, truly saw her. She wasn't rejecting him. She was rejecting it, the idea of being owned, of being touched, of being trapped. She was seeing Silas Bell in his shadow. He said nothing. What was there to say? He couldn't promise her he wasn't a man who would own her. He couldn't promise her anything. He was a ghost, just like her. He nodded, a single, curt motion. He turned, grabbed his coat from the peg, and walked to the door. He did not say goodnight. He pulled the door open. The cold wind rushed in, making the lantern flame dance wildly. He stepped out into the dark. He walked slower than usual, back to his own cold, empty shack. The snow was deep. He didn't feel it. Halfway across the yard, he stopped. He turned. He looked back at her cabin, at the single, small, flickering light in her window. She was in there, alone, afraid. He stood for a long time, watching her light, before finally turning and facing his own darkness. The kiss was a broken thing. A question asked, and then, in panic, taken back, for 3 days, they did not speak. The silence was louder than the storm had been. Elias was back in his own shack. He kept his fire going, the chimney smoking. He did not go to her cabin for the shared meal. He chopped wood, the sound of his axe a sharp, angry punctuation in the cold air. He was splitting logs at a furious pace, as if trying to exhaust the tension from his own shoulders. He was ashamed, not for the kiss, but for the fear he had seen in her. He had pushed. He had been the man she expected, the man who takes. Cora, too, retreated. On the second morning, Elias found a cloth-wrapped loaf of bread on his porch rail, not from the oven, but the bread he had helped knead. It was cold, a payment, a dismissal. The next day, he shot a grouse. He cleaned it, wrapped it, and left it on her porch. An answer, a transaction. They were back to being neighbors, but the truce was broken. The shared space, the easy silence, had been charged and then shattered. Now, the quiet was heavy, loaded with the words she had spoken, property. The thaw came on the 4th day, not as a gentle melt, but as a messy, gray surrender. The snow receded, leaving sucking mud and bare, frozen patches of earth. The road to Sulphur Creek, treacherous and rutted, was once again passable. Elias was running low on kerosene and coffee. He put it off for 2 more days, but the need became unavoidable. He saddled his horse, his rifle in its scabbard. He rode the miles to town, his hat pulled low. Sulphur Creek had survived the blizzard, but it was meaner. The air smelled of wet pine, coal smoke, and desperation. The miners were not working, the ground still too hard, the shafts too dangerous. They were clustered, bored and angry, in the only 2 places that offered heat, the saloon and the general store. Elias tied his horse and stepped onto the boardwalk. He pushed into the store. The room went quiet, not the respectful quiet of a stranger entering, but the sharp, sudden silence of a snake spotted in the grass. The storekeep paused, his hand on a crate. A group of 4 miners, gathered around the pot-bellied stove, stopped their game of checkers. Elias recognized one of them. It was the man who had tried to steal Cora's wood, the one Elias had slammed against the wall. The man's eyes narrowed, a flash of humiliation and hatred. He had told his story. Elias ignored them. He walked to the counter, his boots heavy on the planked floor. "Kerosene," he said to the storekeep, "and coffee. We're low on kerosene." The storekeep said, not moving, "Just fill the tin." Elias said, "Behind him." The whispers started, low, guttural, meant to be heard. "That's him. The widow's new man. Big fella. Think he's enjoying the view?" I'd wager he's enjoying more'n the view. She works fast." Elias kept his back to them, his shoulders set. He had heard this all before. This was the same sewer air that had filled the saloons in Dodge. "Heard she's a good cook," one of them said, louder. "If you like a strong stew." A few of them laughed. A short, ugly sound. Elias set his coins on the counter. The storekeep finally moved, taking the tin to fill it from the barrel in the back. Elias waited. One of the miners, a large man with a tobacco-stained beard and a sour smell, got up from the stove. He was not the one Elias had handled, but a friend, bolder and drunker. He walked over, unsteady on his feet, and stood next to Elias at the counter. Elias did not look at him. He stared straight ahead, at the shelves of tinned beans. "You like living off that widow, mister?" The miner growled, his breath hot with whiskey. "Like living with a woman who poisoned her own husband?" Elias remained still. "I'm talking to you," the man said, nudging Elias's arm. Elias turned his head, slowly. He looked at the man. His eyes were flat, gray, and cold as the ice still clutching the river. He said nothing. The miner had expected a reaction, a protest, a shove. The silence, the absolute stillness from Elias, unnerved him. He had to push further, to regain his footing in front of his friends. "What's the matter? She got your tongue, too." He grinned, showing black-green teeth. "Or maybe you like the taste of poison." He drew in a breath, puffed his cheeks, and spat. A thick, brown stream of tobacco juice and spittle flew from his lips and landed squarely on the toe of Elias's left boot. The store went dead silent. The checker piece, halfway to the board, stopped. This was it, the moment of violence, the trigger. Elias looked down at his boot. He saw the brown stain spreading on the dark leather. He looked back up, his gaze never wavering from the miner's face. He didn't move. He didn't wipe it. He didn't flinch. He didn't draw. The miner's grin faltered. The silence stretched, becoming painful. Elias's stillness was an accusation, a mirror. He was not reacting. And in not reacting, he held all the power. "You're dripping," Elias said. His voice was a quiet rasp, barely disturbing the air. The miner blinked, confused. He looked down at his own chin, then back at Elias. The moment was gone. The fuse had been lit, but Elias had pissed on it. The man was left standing there, a fool who had spit on an unmoving stone. The storekeep hurried back, his eyes wide. He slammed the tin of kerosene on the counter. Elias paid. He picked up his coffee, his kerosene, and turned his back on the miner. He walked out of the store. The spit was still on his boot. He walked past the silent, watching men, his footsteps even, his back straight. He stepped outside, into the cold, clean air. He wiped his boot clean on the mud and snow of the boardwalk, mounted his horse, and rode out of town. Never looking back, he rode hard. The quiet contained fury in his chest, a cold, hard knot. He was not angry at the miner. He was angry at the world that made such men. He was angry at the whispers that had cost him his brother and were now trying to cost him his peace. When he got back, he saw Cora outside, trying to clear a patch of ground for her spring garden. The earth still hard. He dismounted, walked to her fence line. "Cora!" She looked up, surprised. He had not used her name since the night of the kiss. "They're talking," he said, not bothering with a greeting. "They always talk," she said, turning back to her work, her voice bitter. "No, it's worse. It's because of me, that miner I pushed. He's been busy." He paused, then said it. "One of them spit on my boot in the store." She stopped digging. Her shoulders went rigid. She slowly turned to face him. He had expected her to be angry at him for bringing this. Instead, her face was pale, her eyes wide with a familiar, haunted fear. "What did you do?" she whispered. "I did nothing," he said. "I bought the coffee. I left." She stared at him. She was processing this. She had seen her husband, Silas, get into 3 fistfights in that same store over perceived slights, over a card game, over the price of feed. Silas, who was always proving his strength, his ownership. And here was Elias, a man who could break a miner in half. A man who, in her cabin, had confessed to killing, and he had stood there and taken it for her, to protect her from more gossip. You let him?" she said, her voice full of a strange wonder. "It was just spit," Elias said. "It wasn't worth the noise." That night, she came to his shack. She knocked. He opened the door. She was holding a covered bowl. "I made stew," she said. He stepped aside. She came in. The shared meals were back, but the air had changed. The shame was gone. The truce was over, replaced by something new. They ate at his small, rough table. For a long time, there was only the sound of spoons. "He'll do it again," she said, her voice low. "They'll push until you push back. That's what men like that do." "I've pushed back before," Elias said, his voice flat. "It doesn't end well. Not for anyone." "You need to know," she said, suddenly, as if the words were being forced out of her. "You need to know what you're standing next to." "What they're right about." Elias looked at her. "I don't need to know anything." "Yes, you do." Her hands were trembling, but she clasped them on the table. Silas, he wasn't just mean, he was meticulous." Elias just listened. His face was granite. "He controlled everything, every dollar. I never had a single coin, not one. He bought the flour, the salt, the thread. He said it was to protect me from my own weak mind. He liked telling the storekeep that. He told everyone I was sickly, that I was barren." She said, the word a bitter stone in her mouth. "He liked that I was isolated. He liked that no one would believe me, that I had no one. He owned this land. He owned this house. And he owned me." Elias's hand resting on the table, slowly, unconsciously, clenched into a fist, his knuckles white. "I tried to leave him," she whispered. "The first year, before I gave up, I packed a small bag, just a dress. I had no money. I was going to walk to Bozeman. I didn't care. I got to the creek, just at the edge of the property." Her voice was raw, the memory fresh. "He found me. He didn't even yell. He just smiled. He grabbed my arm and dragged me back to the house, to the bedroom." She stopped. She was staring at the wall, but she was seeing that room. "He tied me to the bedpost," she said, her voice dead. "With a rope. He left me there, Elias, for a full day and a night. He brought his plate in and ate his dinner, right there, watching me. He said he was teaching me about vows. When he finally untied me," she couldn't finish. She just shook her head, the motion small, violent. "I never tried again. I learned to be quiet." The confession hung in the small, hot room. This was the truth behind her fear. This was the ghost of Silas Bell. Elias was silent for a full minute. The rage coming off him was not hot. It was cold. It was a still, deep, terrifying cold. It was the absolute zero of his soul. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, guttural rasp, a sound from the bottom of a well. "You buried him." Cora looked up, her eyes wide, tears she hadn't shed brimming. "What?" "You buried him," Elias repeated, his eyes locked on hers. "In the ground. That's justice enough." Cora's breath hitched. She was waiting for the next question. "Did you do it? Did you poison him?" But the question never came. He was looking at her, and his face held no judgment. It held understanding. He didn't care how Silas died. He only cared that he was dead. Her silence was its own answer. She didn't deny it. She didn't have to. He had seen her truth, and he had not turned away. The next few days were a new world. The thaw was in full swing. The air was softer. The confession had not broken them. It had forged them. He was in her kitchen. It was their kitchen now. He had come in from mending the fence, and the cabin was warm, smelling of yeast. She was baking bread, her arms deep in a large wooden bowl, her face smudged with flour. "You're fighting it," he said, his voice quiet. She looked over, a small, tired smile. "It's stubborn. No, you're trying to punish it. He came up beside her, washing his hands in the basin. You have to convince it. He dried his hands, dusted them with flour from the sack. May I? She nodded, stepping aside. He put his hands in the bowl. His movements were different from hers, not angry, but slow, strong and rhythmic, pushing, folding, turning the dough over on itself. You know how to bake bread? She asked, a hint of a smile in her voice. Long winters in bunkhouses, he said, not looking up. You learn, or you eat hardtack that'll break a tooth. She stood beside him, her shoulder almost brushing his. She put her hands back in the bowl, next to his. They worked together, their hands, his large and scarred, hers smaller and strong, moving in the flour. His hand covered hers, guiding her. Like this, push and fold. His touch was not a claim. It was not a demand. It was reverence. His thumb stroked the back of her hand, flour and all. Cora stopped breathing. She stopped kneading. He stilled. His hand lingered on hers. He looked at her, his eyes clear. You deserve 1,000 better mornings, he whispered. It was not a promise. It was a fact. It was absolution. It was everything she had never been told. This time, she did not pull away. This time, there was no memory of Silas. There was only Elias. She leaned into him. She rested her flour-dusted forehead against his shoulder. Her hands, covered in dough, came up and rested flat against his chest. She just leaned, a full surrender of her weight. Elias's arms came around her, holding her tight. Flour, dough, and all. He rested his chin on the top of her head and closed his eyes. They stood like that for a long time, two broken people holding each other up in a warm kitchen. That night, they gave in. He didn't go back to his shack. The bread was baked. The stew was eaten. The silence was full and comfortable and charged. He was at the door, his coat in his hand, ready to leave, ready to give her the space, if she still needed it. Elias, she said. He turned. She was standing by the stove. She was not afraid. Her eyes were steady. She was not a girl, not a victim. She was a woman. He dropped his coat. He walked to her. He didn't kiss her. He raised a hand and laid it on her cheek, his thumb brushing the flour smudge he had seen earlier. It was raw. It was slow. It was the first time for both of them, in different ways. For him, it was the first time he had touched a person in years with anything but violence. For her, it was the first time she had been touched with anything but ownership. It was not a taking. It was a sharing. It was quiet and desperate and healing in the dim light of her cabin, with the wind whispering outside. The next morning, they did not talk about it. He woke first, in her bed. He watched her sleep. When she woke, she turned and saw him watching her. He did not smile. He just looked at her, his eyes, usually so guarded, now open. She looked back, her eyes, usually so sad, now calm. Their eyes did all the talking. I see you. I'm still here. The peace lasted for 2 weeks, 2 weeks of better mornings. They worked side by side, clearing the land, mending the fences, rebuilding the coop. They were a team. The town of Sulphur Creek and the world that had broken them seemed 1,000 miles away. Then, trouble arrived. It came on a Monday. Elias had ridden into town. This time, he was not just buying for himself. He had a list from Cora, sugar, beans, and a new ribbon, if he could find one. He sensed the change as soon as he tied his horse. There was a new horse outside the saloon, a fine-looking bay with a good saddle. And there was a new man. Elias walked into the general store. The same miners were there. But this time, they weren't whispering. They were watching, waiting. The saloon door opened, and the new man walked in. He was tall, dressed in a black suit, a city suit. He had a thin, mean mouth and eyes that darted around, assessing. He looked at Elias. He looked at the miners. "Which one of you is sleeping with the murderess?" he announced, his voice high and reedy. Elias turned. Slowly. The man smiled. A thin, greasy expression. "Ah, it must be you, the big one." He walked up to Elias, his heels clicking. "My name is Arthur Bell. Silas Bell was my cousin." He turned, projecting his voice to the miners. "I've been in Bozeman, talking to the magistrate. Been hearing all the stories from this town about how my cousin died, about how he was poisoned." That's just talk," the storekeep said, his voice nervous. "Is it?" Arthur Bell snapped. "She's a black widow, that's what she is, and she's squatting on my land." "That land belongs to Cora," Elias said, his voice low. "It belongs to the Bell family," Arthur shouted, his face turning red. "And I'm the only family left. I'm here to take it. I'm filing a formal claim on the property. And I'm filing a formal accusation of murder against Cora Bell. I'm here to see her hanged." He turned back to Elias, his eyes gleaming. "And you're just the hired stud. You can stay and watch, or you can get out of my way." Elias looked at him. This was not a fighter. This was a scavenger, a coyote, come to steal the kill. "You'll stay away from her," Elias said. Arthur laughed. "Or what? You'll shoot me? I'm not a fool. I'm doing this with the law. The judge will be here in 2 weeks, and we're going to have a hearing. She's got no right, and you, mister, have no say." Arthur Bell smiled, adjusted his suit, and walked out of the store, heading toward the small building that served as the town's land office. Elias stood there. The new peace was over. The whispers had finally become a shout, and this time, it wasn't a wolf or a miner. It was a man with a piece of paper, and he was coming for Cora. Elias rode back to the shack, the bag of coffee and beans a heavy, meaningless weight on his saddle. The kerosene tin felt like it was full of lead. He walked into Cora's cabin. It was their cabin now, though no word had been spoken, and she looked up from the stove, a question in her eyes. "Trouble," Elias said. He didn't soften it. He set the supplies on the table. "His name is Arthur Bell, Silas's cousin. He's in town." Cora's hand, which had been stirring a pot, went still. The blood drained from her face, leaving it the color of winter ash. "He's come for the land," she whispered. It wasn't a question. "And for you," Elias said, his voice flat. "He's filing a claim, and he's accusing you of murder. He's using the town's gossip to do it." Cora sat down, hard, on the small stool by the fire. She put the spoon down. She looked at her hands. They were trembling. "So," she said, her voice a dead thing, "it's finally come. We'll fight it," Elias said, the words coming out hard, like stones. "We'll tell the judge the truth. We'll—" "Fight?" She looked up at him, and her eyes were hollow, the same hollow he'd seen the first day he saw her hanging laundry. "You don't fight men like that, Elias. You don't fight town gossip. It's not a wolf you can shoot. It's like weather. You find a way to stand until it passes, or you get buried. I am not letting him bury you." Elias knelt in front of her, a movement that was foreign to his body. He was too big for this. This is not Silas. This is not a man you are tied to. This is a scavenger. We can beat him." "How?" she asked, her voice cracking. "By telling them what you know, that I was a bad wife, that I hated him, that I was glad when he died. They'll hang me, Elias. They want to hang me. They will not," he said. He didn't know how he would stop it. He just knew he would. Arthur Bell was thorough in his cruelty. He didn't just wait for the judge. He spent the next 2 weeks in Sulphur Creek, living at the small, dirty hotel. He spent his money in the saloon, buying rounds of whiskey for the miners, his reedy voice growing louder with each day. He was a storyteller. He told them about his dear cousin Silas, a simple, trusting man who had taken in a cold, barren woman who repaid his kindness with poison. He fed them their own ugly whispers, and they consumed it like cheap liquor. The poison spreading, settling in. The summons came, not as a letter, but as a formal notice, delivered by the town's part-time constable. He was a young man who looked afraid, as if the paper itself might contaminate him. He rode up, dropped the folded summons on Cora's porch, and rode away without a word. The hearing was set for a Wednesday, the 10th of March. The circuit judge, a man named Harlan, was coming through. The hearing would be held in the land agent's office, the only official building in town, save for the saloon. Elias wanted to plan. He wanted a strategy. He paced the small cabin, his fists clenching and unclenching. "You'll tell him about the rope, about the bruises. You'll tell him what you told me." "No," Cora said. She was sewing, mending a tear in his shirt. Her stitches were tiny, perfect, and angry. I will not lay my shame out for those men to look at. I did not show them my bruises when Silas was alive. I will not show them his ghost just so they can spit on it." "Cora, this is not about shame. This is about the truth." "The truth," she said, not looking up from her needle. "The truth is, I'm a widow, alone, and he is a man with family and a voice. The truth, in this town, is whatever the loudest man in the saloon says it is." On the morning of the 10th, the air was cold. The mud had frozen overnight, making the ground hard and unforgiving. Cora put on her best dress. It was a drab gray wool, the same one she wore every Sunday to tend her husband's grave, a chore she performed with a grim, dutiful anger. She brushed her hair until it was slicked back, pulled into a knot so tight it seemed to pull the skin taut around her eyes. She looked severe, pale, and unbreakable. Elias saddled his horse and her mare. They rode to town in silence. When they reached the edge of Main Street, they dismounted. They tied the horses to the last hitching post, near the abandoned blacksmith shop. It was too far. The walk to the land office was 3 long blocks. It was intentional. They would have to walk. They stepped onto the boardwalk. The town was waiting. It was silent. No one was working. The miners were not at the shafts. The women were not at the general store. They were just there, standing in doorways, leaning on porch posts, watching. They were crows, a whole town of them, black and silent, perched and waiting for the carrion. Cora's steps faltered. Elias felt her hesitate. He did not take her arm. He did not offer a hand. He just moved to her left, walking between her and the town. He was a wall. "1 foot," he said, his voice low, for her alone. "Just the next foot, that's all." She looked at him. His face was granite. He was not with her. In her fear, he was somewhere else, a place of hard, cold duty. She nodded. She put 1 foot in front of the other. They walked. The sound of their boots on the wood was deafening. He heard a window slide open. He saw Mrs. Miller, the storekeep's wife, peer out, her face pinched with judgment, before pulling the curtain shut. He saw the miners, the ones from the store, clustered by the saloon. They weren't whispering now. They just stared, their arms crossed, their faces blank and hateful. Elias kept his hand away from his hip. He was not a lawman. He was not a gunman. He was just a man, walking a woman through a gauntlet. He felt the familiar, sick heat in his gut, the one he'd felt in Dodge. But this time, it was not rage. It was a cold, pure focus. "Get her inside." Cora kept her head high. She stared straight ahead, at the door of the land office. She did not look left. She did not look right. She was walking to her own execution, and she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her run. They reached the door. Elias opened it. He let her pass. He followed her in, and the door shut, closing out the silent, watching town. The room was too small, too hot. It smelled of stale tobacco, coal smoke, and unwashed bodies. It was packed. Arthur Bell was at a small table, a thin, city-bought lawyer at his side. The miners Elias had seen, the ones who had whispered, were there, lining the back wall. They were the witnesses. Judge Harlan was a man of 60, with a face like a tired bloodhound and eyes that had seen too much. He sat at the agent's desk. "Mrs. Bell, Mr. Graves, you're late." We're on time, Elias said. Sit, the judge ordered, pointing to 2 chairs. Isolated in the middle of the room, the hearing began. Arthur Bell's lawyer was slick. He painted a picture of a frail, loving Silas, a community-minded man who had been taken advantage of by a cold and unhappy wife. He called the miners, one by one. They took the stand. Did you ever see her smile at him? No, sir, not once. What about at the funeral? Stood there, dry as a bone, didn't shed a tear, not one. And what was the talk around town before he died? Well, the miner, the one who had spit on Elias's boot, said, savoring it. He told me, Mr. Bell did. He said he was feeling poorly. Said he thought she was putting something in his stew. Or hearsay, Elias said, his voice quiet. It's testimony. The lawyer snapped, and I'll thank you to be quiet until you're called. Finally. Arthur himself. He spoke of family legacy, of the land, of his cousin's dying wish that the Bell name be protected. He looked at Cora. She's a murderess, and she has no right to that land. The judge looked at Cora. Ma'am, do you have anyone to speak for you? Cora was frozen. She was staring at her hands. Elias stood up. I will. He walked to the desk, put his hand on the Bible. The constable, the same boy who delivered the summons, held it out, shaking. State your name. Elias Graves. The lawyer stood. Mr. Graves, you are a new arrival. Yes. And you currently reside where exactly? On the property bordering Mrs. Bell's. In fact, the lawyer said, pacing, you've been seen on her property, have you not? Fixing her roof, sharing her meals. Some might say, sharing her bed? The room snickered. Cora flinched, as if struck. Elias's eyes never left the lawyer. I'm her neighbor. I helped her after her livestock was attacked. How noble. The lawyer sneered. Tell me, Mr. Graves, what is your interest in this? Are you in love with the widow? I'm here as a witness to her character. Her character? The lawyer laughed. And what do you know of character? What were you, before you came here, a farmer, a gambler? He turned to the judge. Your Honor, this is a drifter. His testimony is worthless. Mr. Graves. The judge interrupted, his voice heavy. What did bring you to Sulphur Creek? You have an honest face, but an air of trouble. Are you running from something? This was it, the moment. Elias looked at Cora. She was watching him, her face pale, her eyes begging him. Don't! He looked at the judge. He looked at Arthur Bell. He looked at the townsfolk, their faces hungry. Yes, Elias said. The room went silent. I was running. From what? The judge asked. From myself, Elias said. He took a breath. I came from Dodge City. I was a deputy marshal. A gasp went through the room. The miners looked at each other. A lawman. A lawman, the lawyer said, his voice suddenly uncertain. I left, Elias continued, his voice hard and clear, ringing in the small, hot room. Because I was no longer fit to wear the badge. I was in a gunfight. My brother was killed. He paused, the memory thick in his throat. After, a boy, a kid, no older than 20. He was part of it. But he was drunk, scared. He had his gun out, but it was pointed at the floor. He was no threat. He looked at the judge, at the men. He was no threat, and I emptied my pistol into him. 6 shots. I did not stop pulling the trigger. It was a mistake. It was murder, and I knew it. He let the words hang. So I left. I burned my badge. I came here to be done, to be quiet. So, yes, I am a drifter. I am a man who has killed, but I am not a liar. And I am telling you, this court, that Cora Bell is the most honest and the most brutalized woman I have ever known. And she did not kill her husband. She just survived him. He was done. He walked back to his chair. The room was stunned. Arthur Bell was white-fisted. Elias had not just defended Cora. He had exposed himself. laid his own raw, bloody past on the table for them all to see. The judge stared at Elias, his expression unreadable. He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Bell, Cora Bell, stand." Cora stood, her legs shaking so badly Elias could see the wool of her skirt vibrate. "Ma'am," the judge said, his voice softer now, "you have heard the testimony. You have heard what your neighbors say. You have heard your friend. I ask you, under oath, did you poison your husband, Silas Bell?" Cora looked at the judge. She looked at Arthur. She looked at the faces of the miners, who had condemned her for 2 years, and she broke. The dam of her silence, the wall she had built, it just crumbled. A sob tore out of her throat, a raw, animal sound of pure, bottomless grief. "Poison?" she cried, her voice cracking, echoing. "You want to know about poison?" "Yes," Arthur Bell shouted, standing. "Tell us, did you—" "I thought about it," Cora screamed. The room gasped. Elias's heart stopped. "Yes," she wept, the tears streaming down her face, washing away the pale, severe mask. "I thought about it. I thought about it every day. I thought about it when he found me trying to leave, and he dragged me back, and he tied me to the bedpost. He left me there for a full night and a day, and he sat in a chair and ate his dinner and watched me." The room was silent, horrified. This was not the story they had been told. "I thought about it," she continued, her voice a raw whisper. "When he broke my wrist and told Dr. Miller I fell down the porch steps. I thought about it every time he shoved me, or gripped my arm until it was black, or when he'd come to my bed. After, I prayed for him to die, every night. I prayed to God to strike him with lightning. I prayed he would fall down a mine shaft. I prayed for an end." She was looking at the judge, at everyone, her shame and her pain exposed for them all. "But I didn't do it," she whispered, her voice breaking. I was too afraid of him, even to save myself. I didn't poison him. I watched him get sick, and I didn't feel sad. He died, and I was just tired." "The rumor," she said, her voice gaining a thin, reedy strength. "You all want to know about the poison rumor?" She looked at the miners. "He started it, Silas, a year before he even got sick. He told Mr. Miller. He told everyone. He said I was unstable. He said he worried what I might do. He did it so no one would help me. He did it so if I ever screamed, you would all think I was the crazy one. He did it to isolate me. He poisoned me for years, and you all helped him." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of guilt, the silence of shame. Judge Harlan stared at Cora, his face a mask of profound sadness. He turned his gaze to Arthur Bell. "Mr. Bell, you have brought this case, this accusation. What proof do you have, other than the whispers of a dead, cruel man and the gossip of this town?" Arthur was sputtering. She confessed. She said she thought about it." "Thinking about it is not a crime, Mr. Bell," the judge said, his voice rising to a low roar. "Not even in Montana. You have brought me no proof. You have no medical testimony. You have no witnesses to the act. You have nothing but hearsay, spite, and greed." He picked up his gavel. "This accusation is dismissed. The claim on the land is dismissed. The property belongs to Mrs. Bell by law and by right of endurance." He slammed the gavel. "This hearing is over. Get out!" No one moved. The spell was broken. Cora had won, but she stood in the middle of the room, weeping, having stripped her soul bare in front of the very people who despised her. Elias stood. He walked to her. He did not touch her. He just stood in front of her. A shield. "Cora, it's done." She looked up at him, her face a ruin. He offered his hand. She took it. He let her out. He pushed the door open. The crowd on the boardwalk was still there. They had heard the shouting. They surged forward, hungry. Elias and Cora stepped out, into the cold light. They started the long walk back. The crowd did not part. They stared. Their faces were not apologetic. They were angry. They had been wrong. Their judgment, the bedrock of their small, mean world, had been challenged. "Murderess," a woman hissed from a doorway. "Witch," a man spat. They kept walking. 1 foot, then the next, a rock. It came from an alley, between the saloon and the general store. Thrown by a hand that was quick to hide, it was not a large rock, but it was sharp. It arced through the air, aimed at Cora's head. Elias saw the motion, a flicker from the corner of his eye. He didn't think. He acted. He spun, shoving Cora behind him, turning his own body into a shield. The rock struck him high on the left shoulder, near the collarbone, with a sick, hard thud. Elias grunted, a sharp exhalation of air. The impact was jarring, stinging down to his bones, right on the old scars, but he did not fall. He didn't even turn. He just stood there, a bulwark, his back to the unseen. Cowardly arm. "Elias!" Cora screamed from behind him, her voice high with terror. "Walk," he said, his voice a low growl. "Don't run. Walk." He grabbed her hand, pulled her alongside him, his body still sheltering hers, and they kept moving. They walked the last block, through the sea of silent, hateful faces. They did not run. They got to the horses. He lifted her, his arms screaming, onto her mare. He mounted his own. He did not look back. They rode out of Sulphur Creek, the silence of the town a heavy, oppressive thing at their backs. They did not speak until they were back in her cabin. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the floor. He sat at the table. Cora went to the basin, her hands shaking so hard she could barely pour the water. She came back with a wet cloth and the carbolic. "Take your shirt off." He pulled the heavy wool shirt over his head, wincing as it dragged against the wound. The rock had broken the skin. A dark, ugly cut was welling with blood. She began to clean it. Her touch was rough, her hands still shaking. You bled," she whispered, her voice catching. "For me." "It's just a rock," he said. "You shouldn't have," she said, her back to him as she went to her sewing basket, pulling out a clean strip of linen for a bandage. "You shouldn't have stayed. You shouldn't have said that about Dodge. In front of them, you ruined yourself. For me." She turned. The bandage was clutched in her fist. Her face was a wreck of exhaustion, fear, and an emotion he had never seen there. "Why?" she whispered, the tears starting again. But these were different. They were not for her. "Why would you stay? After all this, they hate me. They hate you now." Elias looked at her, at this woman who had survived a tyrant, survived a town of cowards, survived her own despair. He stood up, his wound forgotten. He walked to her. He reached up his good hand, his right hand, and laid it on her cheek. His thumb brushed away a tear. "Because I die," he said, his voice rough, the words the truest vow he would ever make. "Before I see you alone again." She stared at him for a second. The words hit her, a physical blow, and the last wall, the last defense she had, it just dissolved. She didn't kiss him. She dropped the bandage. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face against his good shoulder, and she cried. She cried for Silas, for the lost years, for the shame, for the rock, for the terror, and she cried for the man who had stood in the fire with her and not flinched. Elias held her. He wrapped his one good arm around her waist and just held on. He did rid his chin on her hair, and he weathered the storm. That night, there were no words left. The hearing, the rock, the confessions. It had all been said, all been bled. The fire was burning low in the stove. They were in the small cabin. The world shut out. He was sitting in the chair, his shoulder bandaged. She was on the floor by his feet, her head resting on his knee. He put his hand on her hair. She looked up. It was not slow. It was not gentle. It was desperation. It was two people who had been to the grave and back, who had been stripped bare, who had nothing left but each other. He pulled her up. He kissed her, his mouth hard on hers. It was a kiss of anger and fear and a profound, desperate hunger. It was not love. It was something more raw. It was survival. They made love on the braided rug in front of the stove. In the dim firelight, it was all hands and lips and the desperate, wordless sound of two people, two ghosts, clinging to each other. A claim in the dark. You are not alone. I am here. It was a fire against the unending, hateful cold. The court's decision was not a victory. It was an exile. In the weeks that followed, the town of Sulphur Creek did not apologize. It did not forget. It turned its back. The silence that had greeted Elias and Cora on the boardwalk was now a permanent, uncrossable chasm. When Elias rode in for supplies, which he now had to do, the storekeep would serve him, but his hands would shake, his eyes downcast. The miners in the saloon would stop talking, and the silence that followed him out the door was heavier and sharper than any thrown rock. They were alone. Truly, finally alone. And winter, as if sensing their isolation, returned with a vengeance. March, which had promised a thaw, instead delivered a deep, killing freeze. The snow did not fall in blankets. It came as hard, icy pellets that stung the skin and promised no melt. Food became scarce. The small supply of canned goods at the general store dwindled. The prices for Elias were suddenly double. The town was starving them out. His hunting, which had been a supplement, now became their only source of survival. And the wolves knew it. The pack that had been scattered by his rifle was back, and it was bolder. They roamed closer, their howls a nightly reminder of the thin wall of wood that kept the world at bay. They were competing for the same few rabbits, the same stringy deer. Elias started going out at dawn and not returning until after dusk. He had to go further, up into the high, dangerous ridges where the wind cut like a razor and the snow was waist-deep. His wounded shoulder throbbed with a dull, cold ache from the thrown rock. It had healed, but it was stiff, a constant, nagging reminder of the town's hatred. He would come back in the dark, his face gray with exhaustion, his beard and eyebrows thick with ice. Sometimes he had a rabbit, sometimes nothing. One night, he stumbled through the door, his rifle slipping from his grasp. He didn't have a rabbit. He just collapsed onto the stool, his hands held out. Cora rushed to him. His hands were a pale, waxy, terrifying white. The tips of his fingers were blue. "Frostbite," she said, her voice sharp, not with pity, but with a practical, rising fear. She didn't wait for him to speak. She got the basin. She filled it with snow, then with water from the kettle, careful to keep it lukewarm. She grabbed his hands, her own warm and rough, and plunged them into the water. Elias hissed, the pain of the returning blood 1,000 sharp needles. He had been so cold, he hadn't even felt the numbness take over. "You're a fool," she said, her voice low and fierce. She was kneeling in front of him, her hands in the basin with his, chafing his wrists, forcing the life back in. A fool, to go that far. For what? One stringy buck? We can eat flour and water. Not for long, he said, his teeth chattering as the warmth of the cabin began to thaw his core. We're low on flour. She tended to him. She rubbed his hands until they were raw and red. She unwrapped his boots and did the same to his feet. She made him drink hot, sweet coffee. And then she bandaged the 2 fingers on his left hand that had blistered from the cold. She fed him hot stew. It was thin, more potato and water than meat, but it was hot. "It's my mother's recipe," she said, watching him eat, her face grim. She said it could cure anything, from a cold to a bad marriage. I'm not sure about the last one, but it's warm. It's good, he said, and he meant it. They had found a new rhythm, born of desperation. The roles they had been forced into by the world, his of violence, hers of victim, were melting away, replaced by the simple, hard facts of survival. She taught him, in the evenings, when the wind was too high to even think of hunting. She taught him her world. She showed him how to make the stew, how to stretch the flour with potato starch to make the bread last. She showed him how to mend a seam, his large, scarred hands clumsy with the small needle. But he learned. She was teaching him, piece by piece, how to build a home. And he taught her. "You're afraid of it," he said one morning, his voice flat. They were behind the cabin. The shotgun Silas had owned was in her hands, the one she had held the day he'd fought the miner. "I'm not afraid," she said. I don't like it. It's loud." "It's a tool," Elias said. He took it from her. He checked the breech. "No different from a hammer or your needle, but you have to know how to use it, or it's useless." He showed her how to stand, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, to absorb the kick, to not be afraid of its power. "You hold it," he said, his hand on her shoulder, positioning her. "So it becomes part of you. You don't fight it, you aim it, you aim the fear." He set up a tin can on a fence post, 50 yards off. Her first shot was high, the kick jarring her, making her step back. "Again," he said, his voice calm, steady. "Don't anticipate it, just squeeze. Let it be a surprise." She fired again. The can was untouched. "You're closing your eyes," he said. "I am not," she snapped. "You are," he said. "Right before you pull, you're afraid to see what you're doing." He stood behind her. "Cora, look at the can, look at nothing else. See the spot you want to hit, now. Breathe out and squeeze." She fired. The shotgun roared. The can spun off the post. A perfect, clean hit. Cora stood there, the smell of sulfur in her nose, the stock of the gun suddenly warm and solid in her hands. She had not flinched. She had not looked away. She looked at Elias. He nodded. Just once. "Good," he said. Again. He was teaching her, piece by piece, how to be safe, how to protect herself, in the long, dark nights, with the stove burning low and the wolves howling in the timber. They talked. They had to. There was nothing left but talk. "We could leave," she said, her voice small. She was darning one of his socks, the wool rough. Elias was cleaning his rifle, the parts laid out on the table, the smell of oil filling the air. He stopped, his hand on the barrel. "Leave? In the spring, when the pass is open, we have a little money. Your gold. We could go to Oregon or California somewhere new." It was the logical, sensible thing. To leave the hate, the whispers, the frozen, barren land. Elias looked around the small, cramped cabin. It was one room. It smelled of them, of wood smoke, coffee, flour, and gun oil. He looked at the roof he had patched. He looked at the stove she kept burning. "And give Arthur Bell the satisfaction?" he asked, his voice quiet. "This isn't about him," she said, though they both knew it was. "This is about a life. We're just hiding here. Elias, we're not living. We're just not dying. I want to plant a garden that I know I'll be able to harvest. I want to not be afraid when I ride into town." He was silent for a long time. He reassembled the rifle, the clicks of the metal precise. "Final. This land," he said, his voice rough. "It's the first place I've stopped, the first place I've slept. The shack, it's just wood." He looked at her. "But it's ours. We bled for it, both of us. That makes it mean something. More than any piece of paper Arthur Bell can file." Cora looked at him. He was right. To run now. It would be a different kind of death. It would be an admission that the town, that Silas, that all of it, had finally won. "So we stay," she whispered. "We stay," he confirmed. "We're not hiding. We're holding. There's a difference." The final challenge came not from the wolves, or the weather, or the whispers. It came, as it always did, from the town. A fire. It started late, on a Saturday night. Elias smelled it first. The wind had shifted, coming from the southeast, from town. It carried the smell not of coal, but of a desperate, hot, consuming blaze. He was out the door in a second. He looked toward town. The sky was not dark. It was a sick, flickering orange. "Stay here," he said to Cora, who was at his shoulder. "Elias, lock the door and keep the shotgun close," he said. He was already running to his horse, pulling the saddle, his movements fast and sure. "What are you doing?" she cried. "They're fools," he said, cinching the strap. "They'll let it burn the whole town down." "It's not your town," she yelled, her voice high with panic. "They hate you. They threw a rock at you." "I know," he said. He swung into the saddle. He looked at her, his face lit by the distant, hellish glow. "But I'm not them." He rode hard, the horse's hooves thundering on the hard-packed, frozen road. He got to Main Street. It was chaos. The saloon, the heart of the town, was an inferno. Flames were 50 feet high, sparks and burning embers catching on the roofs of the general store on one side and the land office on the other. The town was in a panic. Men were throwing buckets of water, a laughably small effort. Women were screaming, running. The saloon owner was just standing in the street, his hands on his head, watching his life burn. Elias dismounted, tying his horse to a post far down the street, safe from the sparks. He grabbed a forgotten bucket and ran to the well. He was just another pair of hands. He formed a bucket brigade. He started yelling, his voice a roar that cut through the panic. "You, get to the store roof! You, to the land office! Wet them down! Forget the saloon! It's gone! Save the street!" The miners, the men who had whispered and hated him, looked at him, but he was a lawman again. His voice was the voice of command, of someone who knew what to do in a crisis. They listened. They began to work. He was at the front of the line, his back to the fire, taking the full, scalding heat on his face, passing bucket after bucket. "My boy!" a woman shrieked. It was Mrs. Miller, the storekeep's wife. She was pointing, her face a mask of terror. "Joshua! He's not... I can't find him. He was at the saloon." The storekeep moaned, his face white. "He snuck in to steal a beer. I saw him. He's in the back." The woman screamed. "The storage room. He hides there." The storage room was at the back of the saloon. The main building was a column of fire, but the back... Elias looked. The back wall was still standing, but smoke, thick and black, was pouring from the single window. "No one can get in there," a miner said, grabbing his arm. "It's death." Elias looked at the woman. He looked at the fire. He saw not a burning building, but a dusty street in Dodge. He saw his brother, bleeding in the dirt. A pistol he didn't draw fast enough. He dropped the bucket. "Elias, no!" the miner yelled. Elias ran. He grabbed a wet horse blanket from a trough. He wrapped it around his head and shoulders. He kicked in the back door. It was locked. He didn't hesitate. He hit it with his full weight, his shoulder crashing through the wood. He went into the smoke. He couldn't see. He couldn't breathe. The air was a thick, black, scalding poison. He dropped to his hands and knees, where the air was a fraction cleaner. "Boy!" he roared, his voice muffled by the blanket. "Joshua!" He heard a sound, a cough, a small, terrified whimper. He crawled toward it. He found the boy, no older than 10, huddled under a shelf of whiskey bottles, crying. "I have you," Elias said. He grabbed the boy, pulled him under the blanket, holding him tight to his chest. "Hold your breath." He stood. He turned. He could not find the door. The smoke was a solid, burning wall. He was blind. He chose a direction. He ran. He hit a wall. He turned. Ran again. He found the opening. A bright, square-shaped hole of fire. He put his head down, tucked the boy, and plunged through it. Just as the roof of the storage room collapsed behind him with a sound like a freight train, he fell out onto the dirt, 20 feet from the building, and rolled, covering the boy with his own body. He was on fire. His shirt was burning. Men were on him, beating out the flames with their hands and coats. He pushed them away. He looked at the boy. "He's breathing." He coughed. He shoved the boy into his mother's arms. Elias stood up. He was burned. His hands were raw. His lungs were on fire. He took 2 steps. He looked at the town. He saw the miners, the storekeep, the gossips, all looking at him. Their faces were not hateful. They were stunned, ashamed. He looked for Cora. She was not there. He had told her to stay. He took another step. The world, which had been orange and red, went gray. His lungs, full of poison, gave out. He collapsed in the mud, face down. Cora found him on the floor of the land office, where they had carried him. He was on a cot. He was unconscious. Doctor. Miller was leaning over him. He's alive, the doctor said, his voice trembling. He was looking at Cora, his eyes full of a new, terrible respect. His hands are burned, his shoulder, but it's the smoke. His lungs are full of it. I don't know. Cora pushed him aside. She knelt by the cot. Elias's face was black with soot, except for the clean tracks where his sweat had run. His hair was singed. His hands were wrapped in clumsy, bloody rags. He was breathing, but each breath was a shallow, wet, rattling sound. "Elias," she whispered. She stayed. The town's hate had been broken by the fire, but she didn't see it. She didn't care. She sat by his cot for 2 days. She did not sleep. She washed his face. She held a wet rag to his cracked, blistered lips. The doctor came and went. "It's the fever," he said on the second night. "It's in his lungs. I can't do much." Cora was alone with him. The town was afraid to come in. They left food, water, and fresh bandages outside the door. On the 3rd night, his breathing grew shallower. The rattle was worse. He was drowning. Cora, who had not cried at the hearing, who had not cried when Silas died, broke. She grabbed his hand, his bandaged, burned hand. "No," she said, her voice a low, fierce growl. You don't get to do this. You don't get to save everyone and then leave me." She was crying, her tears falling on his chest. "You said you'd die before you saw me alone again," she whispered, her voice breaking. You liar. Don't you die. Don't you dare die. I need you." She laid her head on his chest, her ear over his struggling heart, and she wept. "Cora!" The voice was a bare, rough, dry croak. She snapped her head up. His eyes were open, just slits. He was looking at her. "Elias!" She breathed. He tried to cough, a pained, terrible sound. "Didn't come here to be a hero," he whispered, each word a piece of broken glass. He looked at her, his eyes clear, even through the pain. "But I found a reason to live." He meant her. The spring thaw, when it finally came, was real. It was a true melt. The ice on the river broke with a sound like cannon fire. The ground softened. The air smelled of mud and pine and life. They rebuilt the coop. They did it side by side. His hands were still scarred, the new pink skin tender, but he could hold a hammer. She held the boards. They worked in the new, warm sun, the silence comfortable, easy. They planted seeds. He dug the furrows in the dark, rich soil he had prepared with ash from their stove. She followed, dropping the seeds, corn, beans, and squash. They worked with their hands in the dirt, on their knees, side by side. One afternoon, Cora came out of the cabin. Elias was sitting on the porch, a piece of scrap pine in his lap. He was carving. He had his old, sharp knife, and he was working the wood. She stood by him, watching. He was carving letters, deep and sure. He finished. He blew the shavings off. He held it up for her to see. It was a new nameplate, to hang over the door of her cabin. It read, Belle Graves. Cora looked at the wood. She looked at his name. Next to hers, "So?" she whispered, a small smile touching her lips for the first time in memory. "We're not ghosts anymore." Elias put the knife down. He looked at her, at the sun in her hair, at the life in her eyes, at the woman who had walked through the fire with him. He took her hand, the one that was dirty from the garden. He turned it over and very gently. He kissed her knuckles. "No, ma'am," he said. "We're home."